Welcome everyone to World Gone Weird. I'm ready to dive into the deep end. Let's try to make sense of, well, everything. Or at least try to, right?
Everything's weird these days, that's for sure. I swear every time I turn on the news, I just shake my head. Welcome, listeners. Prepare yourselves for another dose of reality, unfiltered, or at least as unfiltered as we can manage.
Hey everyone, great to be back. And yeah, Jimmy, I feel you. It's like living in a perpetual Twilight Zone episode. But hey, maybe we can find some silver linings, Shine a little light on the weirdness.
All right, gang, buckle up. World Gone Weird coming at you live. I've got my sarcasm shield fully engaged, which, let's be honest, is basically a permanent setting at this point. So bring on the dystopia.
Okay, so I was thinking, something that's been on my mind is this whole thing with virtual reality training simulations, extreme VR. It seems like everyone's jumping on board, especially for high-stakes jobs, right? Military, first responders, even surgeons are starting to use them, and I'm thinking about the potentially unintended consequences. It's a complicated system of potential effects on real-world behavior.
GR training, huh? So, you're saying these guys are going to go from playing Call of Duty to storming a real building? I don't know. Sounds like a recipe for disaster to me. And what about the psychological impact? Are they even thinking about that?
Well, hold on a sec, Jimmy. I see the potential benefits too. I mean, think about it. Soldiers can train for intense combat situations without any real risk. Surgeons can practice complex procedures over and over again until they're perfect. It could save lives and improve outcomes. But I agree, we need to consider the downsides. It's all about balance.
Oh, I can see it now. Surgeon simulator now with haptic feedback. What could possibly go wrong? Seriously though, it's like we're turning into that episode of Black Mirror, but instead of existential dread, it's just skill fade. What if these VR simulations make them worse at their jobs?
Exactly, Sarah. That's what I mean. It's not just skill fade, but, for example, if a soldier is constantly trained in a VR environment where enemies are always clearly marked and follow predictable patterns, what happens when they encounter a real-world situation with unpredictable actors and incomplete information? There's got to be some sort of disconnect. That can't be good.
Yeah, the real world ain't got a HUD, folks. No minimap telling you where the bad guys are hiding. And what about the morality of it all? If you're desensitized to violence in VR, does that make you more likely to pull the trigger in real life? Makes you wonder where the line should be.
Okay, but I think it could also go the other way. Maybe these simulations can help them process the psychological trauma of combat before they even get to the battlefield. Help them develop coping mechanisms. It could be a form of inoculation, right? Building resilience and empathy. If done right, I think it could decrease trigger pulling.
Inoculation? That's adorable, Otto. The military-industrial complex is giving us therapy now. I'm more concerned about the inevitable glitches. Imagine a surgeon's VR rig freezing mid-operation. Sorry, folks, the metaverse crashed. Guess we'll just have to wing it.
Well, glitches are definitely a factor, but I'm more worried about the subtle shifts in decision-making. If you're constantly making life or death decisions in a simulated environment where the consequences are ultimately reversible, does that change your risk assessment in the real world? Are you more likely to take unnecessary risks if you subconsciously believe you can just respawn?
See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's like these politicians playing war games in their fancy offices. They never see the real cost, the human cost. It's just numbers on a screen to them. This VR stuff is just going to make it even worse, detached from reality. And what about data? Who's controlling the algorithms that dictate the simulations? What biases are baked in? Think that's all a bit tinfoil hat.
But wouldn't the data they get from those algorithms be useful? I mean, they could track how people react under pressure, identify potential weaknesses, and tailor training to address those weaknesses. It's about improving performance, right? And if it is all about numbers and data, then aren't we making better choices with actual data in front of us?
Ooh, data-driven warfare. Finally, my spreadsheet skills will be relevant. Seriously, though, who gets to decide what optimal performance even means? And what if these simulations just reinforce existing biases? Like, are we training soldiers to be more likely to shoot minorities because the algorithm says they're statistically more likely to be criminals? Let me reiterate, the glitched algorithm may say they're statistically more likely.
That's a huge point, Sarah. Algorithm bias is a massive issue. And Jimmy, you're right. The data is only as good as the people interpreting it and the assumptions they're making. Take the Social Security Administration, for example. They're trying to reduce phone-based account changes to combat fraud. Seems reasonable, right? But what if that disproportionately affects elderly people or people with disabilities who rely on phone communication? We have to look at the unintended consequences.
Exactly. Another easy solution from these people in charge that probably does more harm than good And what about the soldiers coming back from these VR simulations? Are they getting proper debriefing? Are they getting help processing the trauma they experienced, even if it was just virtual? Or are they just being thrown back into society and expected to be normal?
Well, I hope they're getting the help they need, but I also think we need to be careful not to pathologize these experiences too much. Resilience is a real thing. People can adapt and overcome. I just want to see the human race make it, but damn, the red tape is too much.
Oh, honey, the military doesn't do feelings. The debriefing is probably just a PowerPoint presentation titled "Congratulations, you didn't die," in virtual reality. And then they get a coupon for a free massage at the base spa, because that fixes everything.
It's the long-term societal impact that really concerns me. Imagine a future where crucial decision makers, politicians, CEOs, law enforcement, are all trained primarily in VR. What happens to our understanding of empathy, of nuance, of the messy, unpredictable nature of human interaction? Are we breeding a generation of leaders who are fundamentally disconnected from reality?
I shudder to think. You're right, Jesus. It's like we're creating a whole new class of elites who live in a different world than the rest of us. And they're making the decisions that affect our lives. How are we to hold them accountable? And are we giving up real-world training for something that is cheaper, but not as effective? That's a big issue.
Okay, I see your point. We need to be mindful about who has access to these simulations and how they're being used. Maybe we need some kind of regulatory framework, some ethical guidelines, something to ensure that this technology is used responsibly.
Oh, I'm sure the government will get right on that, just as soon as they figure out how to use VR to train politicians to stop tweeting. I'm picturing a simulation where they have to resist the urge to post inflammatory statements. The reward? A virtual pat on the head and a lifetime supply of digital donuts.
It's not just about regulation, though. It's about education. We need to teach people to be critical consumers of information, to recognize bias, to value real-world experience, media literacy, critical thinking, all that stuff.
Easier said than done, Jesus. People believe what they want to believe. And these tech companies are making billions off of selling them those beliefs. How do you fight that?
By creating better stories, by highlighting the positive examples of people who are using technology for good, by showing that technology can be a tool for connection and empathy, not just division and isolation.
Ah, the power of positive thinking. Look, I'm all for it, but I'm not holding my breath. In the meantime, I'm investing in tinfoil futures, and maybe a VR headset so I can escape this mess.
It's a complex problem with no easy answers. But I think acknowledging the potential unintended consequences of extreme VR training is the first step. We need to have this conversation to raise awareness, to push for responsible development and ethical guidelines, and be aware of the bias that we could be bringing to the table.
Agreed. We need to be vigilant, to question everything, to hold those in power accountable, and maybe unplug from the matrix every once in a while. Go outside, talk to people, remember what the real world feels like, the real, non-simulated world.
Absolutely. And remember that technology is just a tool. It's up to us to decide how we use it, to choose connection over division, empathy over apathy, and hope over despair. It won't be easy, but it's worth fighting for.
Well said, Otto. And if all else fails, we can always move to a remote cabin in the woods and start a self-sustaining commune. Just promise me we'll have VR headsets there too. For educational purposes, of course.
And speaking of the outside world, has anyone been following the situation with that supposed Russian recapture of Suja? I'm seeing conflicting reports, and it's an interesting case study in information warfare. How can a scientific understanding of this conflict be used to predict and mitigate future conflicts?
Another day, another conflict zone. I'm more interested in what they aren't telling us. Seems like more of a tactical maneuver to give the Ukrainians a breather, further weakening them for a more decisive, potentially permanent Russian takeover.
Still, that's people fighting in the field. Something is better than nothing. I would hope that both parties would try to get along and attempt to solve this soon, but I fear that is only a dream at this point.
If I was in the field, you know what I would do? I would be a sniper. But also, Putin has had reservations about all the ceasefires. I think it's a deliberate stalling tactic, or is the Kremlin genuinely trying to negotiate a plausible exit strategy? I'm betting on a combination of both. Pure Machiavellian theater, really.
Machiavellian is right. That's why a data-driven scientific approach is so crucial. We need to cut through the propaganda and analyze the situation objectively. Troop movements, resource allocation, the impact on civilian populations. It's all data points that can help us understand what's really happening. But the lack of data is troubling.
Data? These people lie, Jesus. They manipulate the data to fit their narrative. You can't trust anything they say. You have to look at their actions, their motivations. And Putin's motivation is clear. He wants to restore the glory of the Russian Empire.
Okay, but even if the data is imperfect, it's still better than nothing. It gives us a starting point, a basis for discussion. And we can't just assume that everyone is lying all the time. We have to maintain some level of trust, even if it's just a sliver, especially when it comes to a ceasefire, even a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine.
Trust. In international politics? Oh, Otto, you sweet summer child. I admire your optimism, I really do. But I'm with Jimmy on this one. It's all smoke and mirrors. Just another round of geopolitical chess. Meanwhile, people are suffering and politicians are playing games. I'm thinking of buying some land on Mars. Think that would save me?
Okay. Well, whether we trust the data or not, we need to be aware of the limitations. And we need to apply critical thinking to everything we see and hear. That's the only way we can hope to navigate this increasingly complex and confusing world. And Sarah is right. There's always the possibility of an exit strategy. Not a real one, but a mental one.
All right, I'm just saying be skeptical of everything, especially the people in power. They're not looking out for you. They're looking out for themselves. Don't ever forget that. I don't think people do. Look what happened with the reinstated probationary workers. Some people didn't even care.
But we can't just give up, Jimmy. We have to keep pushing for a better world, a more just world, a more peaceful world. It's not going to be easy, but it's worth fighting for.
Fine, fine. But I'm doing it with a margarita in hand and a healthy dose of cynicism, and maybe a VR headset, just in case. I'm going to buy the island of Fiji with my crypto money.
That's a good point. It's crucial to be skeptical about those in power. The ruling to reinstate those probationary employees in the US highlights the importance of procedural fairness. It makes you wonder about the scientific basis, or lack thereof, behind the Trump administration's policies. I wonder about the measurable consequences for agencies.
Another instance where it feels like the judiciary is overstepping its bounds, trying to strong-arm the executive branch. It just feels like there is an overreach of judicial power.
I think it's just prompting a deeper discussion about the ethical implications of policies, and I think that is never a bad thing. We want more focus on real families and a push for helping more individuals. It is all about the families.
Of course, but I'd love it if they didn't push their views on other people's kids. If people want that, they need to make their own. It's their responsibility. Anyway, how much alcohol is everyone drinking? Speaking of which, what's the exact calculation behind a 200% tariff on European alcohol? Does it take into account the cost of shipping customs valuations and the potential for retaliatory tariffs in return?
See, it goes back to that interconnectedness. Tariffs, trade wars, international agreements. It's all a complex web. And the more complex the system, the harder it is to predict the unintended consequences. Does the model account for potential unintended consequences and feedback loops?
Political theater, that's all it is. Designed to win votes, play to anxieties. It's just political posturing designed to win votes and play to the anxieties of the domestic population, and won't help the American economy in the long run and will likely inflict pain on our consumers.
It's inspiring to see all nations attempting to mediate to get along, and still maintain a diplomatic approach to resolve disputes with the U.S.
I'm sure it is, Otto. You're like the world's optimist. A 200% tariff sounds like a fun time to be a bootlegger. I'm sure people would enjoy it.
Which brings us back to unintended consequences. A tariff on alcohol might seem like a simple way to protect domestic producers, but it could lead to smuggling, black markets, and even organized crime. It all feeds into each other. There is a need for data to determine the impact on supply chains and global trade balances.
These politicians, they never think past the next election cycle. They don't care about the long-term consequences. And what about birthright citizenship? They're talking about ending that now too. I swear, that can't be constitutional.
Well, at least it's a discussion that is prompting a deeper dive into implications for vulnerable people and families. It's better than just nothing.
A hilarious display of the legal system's inherent theatricality. Imagine the sheer volume of paperwork required to overturn such a fundamentally outdated concept. A whole new branch of historical absurdity being explored.
That's where the science comes in. How will this influence gene flow and genetic diversity in the future? What are the measurable consequences for the overall population genetics in the country? You have to have a data-driven analysis before you make such a drastic change.
Right, so much data. Always so many questions.
This is a real issue, It needs real answers, and I think we will get there.